into hostility and is not resolved yet. Still, there are tensions and violence is quite widespread. Radiculation of Islam and neophytes. These are two phenomena which are typical of a Muslim community. In Russia, we have a law on prevention of propaganda of homosexualism, but anti-gay extremism or homophobic extremism manifests itself in other countries as well. This July, Georgia had clashes or the attacks of ultra-right groups against the gays and the journalists who covered the Pride Week. So one reporter was killed and several dozens were injured, were wounded. Political extremism is quite rare phenomenon for the post-Soviet countries. Certainly does exist. We know about assassinations of political actors and of journalists. But still, this movement probably can be discussed on the example of Maidan revolution in Ukraine, when a democratic revolution resulted in the rise of extremist nationalist organizations, which I have already mentioned. There is the flip side of that coin, the manifestation of extremism. Not many countries and governments, as I said, use law against different groupings. The most illustrative case in terms of the West is the banning of witnesses of Jehovah in Russia. Can you please switch off your microphones? Next. In terms of the United States, where the headquarters of the Witnesses of Jehovah is located, these people are not extremists. They do not resort to violence. They don't have any extremist sentiments, but in Russia, they are using the law against that. Officially, according to the Soviet data, there were 9 Witnesses of Jehovah until 1986. In Central Asian countries, the anti-extremism law is being used against the believers. In Tajikistan, for instance, the police may just seize people with bird and would accuse them of religious extremism. In Uzbekistan, thousands of believers who do not belong to any Muslim groups or Islamist communities may even be taken to prison. Naturally, many regimes are using extremist laws in order to fight against their political enemies and rivals. And to conclude my remarks, I do believe that my time is out. In the former Soviet Union, extremism is developing thanks to certain factors. First of all, the Soviet policy of silencing the problems. Many problems were created by the Soviet regime itself. So we see an ideological vacuum after the collapse of the USSR. We see an omnipresent homophobia, and what is so important, and the previous speakers spoke about that, we see shortage in how we work on tolerance. I didn't mention one thing, and I will not deep dive into that. I just made a report on that about the inflow of extremism into internet. Internet allows everyone to speak up, and sometimes these opinions would be extremist. That's very important because in the United States, for instance, we have to find a balance between censorship and putting an end to extremism. Censorship actually has to be decided at the public level and at the level of the civilized community. Thank you so much. I hope that I'm right on time. Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. Dear colleagues, Dr. Giorgio Shani can speak now, and I'm passing the floor over to him at the National Christian University. Professor Shani, over to you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Dr. Valerie Engel for this wonderful invitation. And I apologize, firstly, for being late to this meeting, and secondly, having to leave soon afterwards. If I may, I would like to share my PowerPoint slides. I think I can here. I hope you can see these slides. I may not be able to finish the entire presentation, but within the allotted time, but it's based on a published work, and I can share the link with you. Although I'm in Japan, I mainly focus on South Asia, and I'll be looking at the state of hate within India. And I think perhaps slightly differently from other presentations which I have seen, I'll be focusing upon the role of the state itself in extremism and in intolerance, and particularly the governing ideology of Hindutva, which is an exclusive assertion of a Hindu cultural nationalism. This can be traced back to the work of Veer Savarkar, who is seen as an anti-colonial nationalist, but who was, in many senses, somebody who articulated a form of ethnic-based nationalism. For Savarkar, Hinduism was not a religion. Hindus are not only a nation, but also a jati, a race, a born brotherhood. His understanding of Hindutva was of a nationalist, not a religious concept. And this is the understanding of Hindutva, which the governing Bharatiya Janata Party have used as their within their manifesto in the elections in 2014. It's most forcefully articulated by the RSS, the Rashtra Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the largest civil society organization in the world, with well over 1 million members. Just to give you a bit of the historical background, the Bharatiya Janata Party is the political wing of the RSS. It has only been founded since 1980, but has formed governments in 1996, 1998, and 2014. It is committed to Hindutva, which it regards as a nationalist concept. So for ethno-religious minorities within India, such as Muslims and Sikhs, there is no contradiction for the governing party for them to subscribe to an ideology of Hindutva, even though they are not Hindus. However, things have dramatically changed with the 2019 re-election of Prime Minister Narendra Modi with a landslide majority. This is the first time where the BJP, under their leadership, has had the opportunity to implement an ideology of turning India from a secular sovereign state into a Hindu Rashtra, a Hindu majoritarian state. And I think we can look at movements towards this dramatically from 2019 onwards. In the beginning, if we go back to 2019, August the 5th, you had the revoking of Article 370 in Kashmir. Kashmir, as you may know, is disputed territory between India and Pakistan. And within India, Kashmir, the state of Kashmir, has considerable autonomy. Also, and this is quite important, non-Kashmiris could not buy land within Kashmir. And it is also the only Muslim majority state within India. So in August 2019, the government revoked Article 370, and Kashmir has been ruled directly. The governing party leadership in Kashmir was arrested. So we have the imposition of direct rule. We also have the awarding of disputed land in Ayodhya. to a Hindu trust in order to build a temple to Lord Ram. This is based on the Babri Masjid Mosque, which was destroyed in 1992 by RSS volunteers. And we have the passing of a Citizenship Amendment Act. The Citizenship Amendment Act in 2019, for the first time, tied citizenship to religion, because it gave an opportunity for refugees in South Asia who were non-Muslim to get citizenship. So refugees from other parts of South Asia who went to India, who were Muslim, would be considered illegal migrants. So these can be seen as moves towards a Hindu Rashtra, which was exacerbated, arguably, with the government's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. In contrast with, let's say, the United States and Brazil and other authoritarian populist societies, the Indian government under Narendra Modi initially took a proactive role in combating COVID-19. However, this led him to prematurely argue that India had been successful in stemming COVID-19. This was before, of course, the devastating second wave. There are approximately 35 million cases of COVID-19 in India, and it has resulted in 450,000 deaths, a third in the world. There has been a lockdown, but interestingly, no state of emergency within India. So you have considerable local police forces enforcing this lockdown. And they have done so by basically clamping down on those groups which they consider to be subversive. So we can point to an effective securitization of Muslims. Interestingly, the government uses an act, the Epidemic Diseases Act, which has its origins in the colonial period. So in a sense, the Modi government is using colonial legislation. Allied to this has been an attempt to stigmatize the Muslim minority as being the perpetrators of coronavirus within public discourse. This is not intentional by the state, but we see the hashtag Corona Jihad having been retweeted almost 200 million times once the government had placed restrictions on a Muslim group, the Tablighi Jamaat, and accused it of organizing super spreader events. COVID-19 was also used as a pretext to ban anti-Citizen Amendment Act protests and to detain activists. And I think the contrast here can be seen with the government clamping down on the Tablighi Jamaat, a Muslim organization, and accusing it of being a super spreader, yet allowing the largest Hindu festival and actually the largest religious festival in the world to take place earlier this year. So it's something like 12 million people participated in the Kumbh Mela, the largest Hindu festival in the world, which led to the devastating second wave. Also, I'll be very brief, but there has been an attempt to portray the farmers' protest. We've had almost 100 million farmers within India protesting against the neoliberalization of agriculture. These have been mainly led by members of a Sikh minority within the Punjab. And there's been an attempt by the government and also by the mainstream media in India to portray the protesters as anti-national protesters who are led by religious extremists and Sikh separatists, what they call Khalistanis. So just to conclude, because I know I've taken very much time, India is being rapidly transformed into a Hindu majoritarian state. But interestingly, this takes place within the institution of a liberal democracy. So the democratic structure of India has remained, yet its character has been transformed into a Hindu majoritarian state. And state responses to COVID-19 have further contributed to the securitization of ethno-religious minorities within India. Thank you very much. And if I may, I just would like to share the full article with everyone, just in case they're interested. Thank you very much. Спасибо.
Thank you very much. Спасибо большое,
Thank you so much, Dr. Shani. Thank you so much for this, your very interesting report, and we're looking forward to that link. We see that on the chat. It is available for all the participants in the conference. Dear colleagues, and saying that, I would like to pass the floor to Salamat Malabaev from Kyrgyz State University of Geology. Can you hear me well? We can hear you, but not very well. If you can improve that, we would be very grateful. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the organizers for arranging this very timely conference. Well, we can hear bits and pieces of what you say. I have no more than 10 minutes. Dear colleagues, inaudible. Inaudible. Very often, we may say that my country or Kyrgyzstan has enacted a law on the ban on glorifying Nazi. We know that these processes are going on in many countries of the post-Soviet territory. Today, this concept has acquired a total nature. Kyrgyzstan is no exception. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, we saw the major outflow of the Russian-speaking people from Kyrgyzstan. The history is being revised, the historical memory is being turned down. Even the Soviet science of history said that we have to remember our past in order to have a future. Actually, back in Kyrgyzstan, we're looking at the history of the revolt of 1916. But if we look at that period, the Soviet history failed to say a lot. It silenced certain things during the revolt. It was mainly triggered by Ottoman Empire, by the Third Forces or Germany. And therefore, actually, it was done in order to somehow detriment the Russian Empire. At the same time, in modern Kyrgyzstan, attempts have been made in order to diminish the achievements of the Soviet Union. And actually, the people who would be working in Kyrgyzstan at the time were portrayed as being the cronies of Moscow. And now the Soviet period of history is considered to be the colonial period of Kyrgyzstan, which was then superseded by the independence of the country. most of historians are silencing certain historical facts. Even if we look at the modern history, we'll see, actually, for instance, we'll also see the whitewashing of Nazism, glorifying of Nazism. And for instance, certain Nazi legions have been portrayed as heroes, as fighters for independence. And for instance, the 16th Legion of SS troops now enjoy monuments being erected to glorify them. It should be noted that outside forces contribute to distortion of historical concepts. Without any prejudice to our American partners, but for instance, we had Richard Miles, an American envoy, and he used to tell us about the World War II, that this is the Second World War, but he didn't speak about the role of the Soviet Union, he didn't speak about the Red Army. He mainly spoke about the standoff between American troops and Nazi troops. So that's the situation which has cropped out in Central Asia. I'm done. Thank you so much, dear colleagues. Thank you so much. You saved up a lot of time to us. Thank you so much. I don't see any questions on the chat box, and should there be any questions, we'll ask them to all our speakers, and we'll move forward. Saying that, I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Ruben Zeman from Skopje, Director of the Center for Advanced Researchers, Republic of Northern Macedonia. Mr. Zeman, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you. It's a really great pleasure to participate in this distinguished high-level conference devoted to xenophobia, extremism, and radicalism. Actually, I want to speak for one topic, which actually behind the topic is the roots we can find in Albanian-Serbian antagonism, which historically the conflict started sometimes at the end of the 19th century with the collapsing of the Ottoman Empire, and when the new national states started to create in a Balkan Peninsula, especially around the Berlin Congress in 1878, when actually appeared the issue of protecting of the Ottoman Empire, coming of the Slavic influence from Russia, and also the influence of the Western countries in the Balkans, and the conflict actually really appeared in a war conflict somewhere in the beginning of the 20th century with the Balkan Wars, and before that on the proclaiming of the independent Albanian states, when actually was also put in the topic of the ethnically clean territories. Generally in the Balkans in the 20th century, one of the main issues is about the nation states and ethnically clean territories. And of course the appearing of the issue of Kosovo, which in the beginning of this conflict, it wasn't so much national or ethnic, but it was much more religious conflict, because the ethnic and national identity was not so well developed in the Balkans in the beginning of the 20th century. And then with the with this first and the Second World War, actually, this conflict was not so much on the surface; it was much more underground. But after the Second World War and the creation of the federal Yugoslavia, Tito's Yugoslavia, and with the getting of the autonomy of the Kosovo, then the leadership in Albania started much more to support the separatism in Kosovo and to cultivate actually the idea of the Great Albania or ethnic Albania, as they say. However, during the Yugoslavia, one of the most the great philosophical idea was brotherhood and unity, and of course, Yugoslavia in Tito's Yugoslavia was much more liberal, and the rock music, which actually it was the influence from the West, was so developed. One of the most important rock group was so-called Bielo Dugme, or the white bottom Bielo Dugme, and the main frontman of that group was Goran Bregovic, who was actually the symbol of the Yugoslavian idea, of the Yugoslavian youth, and the symbol of the tolerance and understanding in a former Yugoslavia, and who is actually one of the it's the only actually, how to say, rock composer who also composed one song in Albanian language. You know that Yugoslavia was generally conceived by the Slavic nations, and one of the territories actually, and the Albanian language, which is not Slavic language, was one kind of official language in Kosovo, but not in all territories. However, with the Yugoslav wars in 90s, Goran Bregovic he decided not anymore to write the songs in Yugoslav languages, and he in 1992, as an anti-war song, he made the very famous, I think, also in Russia, the song Kalashnikov, which was in Roma language, and actually it's one anti-war song in Yugoslavia. But during the 1999, when the Kosovo war started, some of the Albanian sociologists and politicians saying that the Serbian soldiers used the song Kalashnikov as a support of their war fights, and sometimes on the killing of the Albanians. Something like the song of the symphony of the music of Wagner was maybe used by the Nazis, and because the Hitler wanted to hear so much the Wagner music, and for that reason Wagner became also the
Sorry, Dr. Zeman.
Yes.
You have 1 minute.
Sorry, yeah, 1 minute. Okay, and then actually after the Kosovo war, and here in the Balkans, now the Albania and Serbia wanted to stabilize the relations between two countries, but of course the Kosovo as an independent state now is functioning not totally recognized, wanted to not to stop this development of the Albanian-Serbian relations. And in this summer, actually, Goran Bregovic was invited in one city of Foča in South Albania to hold a concert in a Bira fest there. And actually, before, when it was announced that Goran Bregovic should be in Albania, it's in a social networks, but not only social networks, they organized a lot of petitions, mainly in Kosovo, and so much debates in the televisions that Goran Bregovic has not to have a performance in Kosovo, and started a very hate speech, chauvinist speech, and so on in the social networks. However, the Goran Bregovic, because I don't have time, I also prepared one video. the concert was held on 22nd of August, but some of the radicals they throw the tear gas to stop the performance. But however, it was not with the big consequences, and the concert, the performance was successfully finished, and a lot of how to say people from Albania. Generally, I didn't mention, we don't have a time mentioning that Albania also have a lot of Orthodox population and a Muslim populations, but I think in the South Albania is much more Orthodox population. They much more participated as audience in this performance of Goran Bregovic there. And again, the song Kalashnikov was actually one of the songs that was performed in this performance. I don't know how much time we have, sorry. I wanted to show some videos, but if you don't have a time, no problem.
Вы можете оставить свой доклад, в том
You
числе
can leave us your presentation together with the video in the
Yes,
chat.
of course.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, of course. Thank you.
Спасибо, доктор Земан.
Thank you, Dr. Zeman, for your interesting presentation and for immersing us in an environment that was quite unusual. And dear colleagues, I have to now give the floor to myself because Mr. Vilkov is not speaking now, and my presentation is next to his in the list. I'm going to put on my presentation for you to better observe what I'm going to talk about. I'll be speaking in Russian. The topic of my presentation is migration phobia in Central and Eastern Europe during the COVID-19 pandemic. It is clear to all of us that we are all aware of what's going on, and this affects us all. And Poland, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and Hungary have felt the brunt of this, have seen some change in the migrant or migration phobia and migration phobic discourse in those nations. In the Central and Eastern Europe countries, before the start of the pandemic, a relatively high level of migration phobia was registered based on the study of 3 groups. We saw, and we can see that in 2018, before even we could think about something like a pandemic, we saw these levels of tensions in these 4 countries. More than half of people said that they were thinking negatively about migrants, especially negatively disposed towards Islamic migrants. That problem was quite relevant at the time, and it remains so at this time, at this juncture. The policy of the Visegrad group of countries is sort of focused on limiting the cross-border migration, and the governments of these countries are resisting to establishing quotas for placing migrants within their boundaries. And after the most recent meeting on the 21st of June of 2021, the meeting of this group of countries, they reaffirmed their negative attitude towards this migration quota, but they agreed at the same time that they need to get their nations more involved in the discussion of the overall European refugee system. And I would like to draw attention to the fact that this has been a major progress compared to the conservative position occupied by the Visegrad governments, let's say back in 2018. The key objection of the governments was related to the increased burden, social and economic burden on their social welfare systems. In fact, the costs of lockdown were really impacting the situation in the social sphere and on the labor market, and not the migration problem, as they thought. Please also pay attention to this slide. which is now on the screen, according to the IMF data, that's the change in unemployment rate. And Slovakia, or rather, sorry, other than in Poland, unemployment hasn't grown anywhere over these years. And therefore, citing labor problems is something that is more associated with the pandemic rather than the migration issue. And if we take a look at the number of initial requests for providing political asylum in the stats, you would see that the change on crossing the border that was set in the spring of 2020 did complicate the plans of those migrants. These restrictions that affected mass meetings, mass events, have deprived of these migration-phobic groups of the right and of the ability to express their opinion about this. And the number of such requests for asylum have decreased in most countries other than Slovakia, and in Hungary it's the lowest. As of 2021, the statistics will look different, at least based on what we've seen from Eurostat. That's what we have at the moment. That's official. Indeed, the number of migrants has decreased, but that hasn't led to a decrease in migration phobia. This picture is a direct replay of Jew phobia in the Central European nations back decades ago. So this continues to be the case, but this time it's migration phobia. And as a result, the actual manifestations of migration phobia on the network, on the internet, this has seen an explosive growth. And as a result, there are no extremist groups as football fans, but these pseudo fans are more active online now. And this creates a problem caused by the pandemic. The thing is that some of the forces, the police and experts, had to switch to dealing with the epidemiological situation, and we'll see that later from the stats provided by the police. The end result of this was that the police was paying less attention to the manifestations of xenophobia on the internet, in forums and whatnot. Well, what is the dynamics of the number of crimes registered, including hate violations? Well, crimes and violations that are hate-based in all these 4 countries are not treated in the same way. And very often the police statistics is something that is a little bit skewed, and very often criminal cases are initiated as criminal cases, but then they are pre-qualified as administrative violations. And we can see a decrease during the pandemic of these numbers of registered crimes that are based on hate. In various countries, criminal codes have a different number of articles treating hate crimes and hate violations. And this is an attestation to the fact that the burden on the police has increased, especially rank and file police. The number of crimes slides down. At the same time, if we look at the manifestations of hate on the internet, that number is actually growing. And we can see that there is another trend. The trend is towards the xenophobia going from the larger cities into the provincial parts of the countries, gravitating towards smaller cities, medium-sized cities, smaller than medium cities. And just look at the key migration centers in Central Europe. This map and this scheme shows this legend. Looks like my time is almost over. I will monitor myself. In blue are the closed centers that deal with illegal migrants. And the open ones are the ones that deal with refugees, asylum seekers, and legal migrants. And the problem of the far-right group's activities is that it is moving from the larger cities to the provinces. And during the pandemic, it wasn't the well-organized groups that have been on the forefront, but rather they were the autonomous groups. Let me just give you one example of what I mean by this. This is what happened in Bialystok. Just note where it is. This is Bialystok, close to the border with Belarus, to the northeast of Poland. And if you speak Polish, you don't require any explanation, but those who don't, I can translate this on this postcard that you can see on the left. The extremists are asking the question, do you want someone of your relatives to become victim of an attack or of a robbery? The rhetoric is very straightforward and far-right extremist. If we look at the picture on the right, especially, and there are no indications of whether this is the postcard that was really sent out or was just an internet campaign, but this product with the logos of far-right groups was fabricated. And I would stop at this point. Thank you very much for your attention. And now I'm happy to, well, I don't see any questions right now. Let us ask those questions to each other later. I will switch back to my role. I would like to give the floor now to Dr. Giovanni Savino from the Institute of Social Sciences of the Russian Academy of National Economy and Public Service. Mr. Savino. Hello. Thank you for introducing me. Can I also share my slides? I would really appreciate this. You should be able to do this. This button should be active. I'll see. Yes, it is active. Excellent. Thank you for giving me this right. I'll speak English because my Russian and my other foreign languages are not that good as my Italian is. So I'll prefer English.
Today my relation is about the fact of how anti-vaxxers discourse became the new thing, the new great radical thing for the far right in Europe, and not only in Europe. Starting from the Italian case, that is quite interesting for being a special case. In Italy, at this moment, there is one of the biggest percentual of vaccinated people with 2 shots it is 77%, followed by Germany and by France. But in the last weeks, the protest called by this movement that labeled themselves as no green pass. The green pass is the EU green certificate that is used in Italy for accessing to work places and to cultural places and restaurants and so on, was under a big attack by several different forces. The real reason made by these forces is their contrariety to vaccination campaign, as they were at the beginning against the adoption of the containment measures that are typical of Italy from March 2020, when the pandemic started on a speed race. And the investment made by the Italian far right from the very beginning was really high. Here, when we are talking about far right, we must be clear, because we are referring to Forza Nuova, this neo-fascist movement founded in 1997 by Roberto Fiore and Massimo Morsello, former terrorists that went into hiding in London in the 80s and came back to Italy when the allegation against them went prescriptive. Roberto Fiore posed himself, Morsello died 19 years ago, as always searching issues for trying to monopolize the attention on the variegate area of the Italian far right, and trying to move Forza Nuova as the main militant force in the far right. There is a competition between Causa Pound, that is the other main neo-fascist organization in the far right, and Forza Nuova, and there is an issue too with other two parties, that it will be not so possible to call them neo-fascist. One of them, Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, it is possible to call as post-fascist in some way, and the League, that is the daughter structure of the former Northern League, led by Matteo Salvini, that adopted in many cases nationalist, populist, and near to neo-fascist arguments and rhetorics. So what happens is that Roberto Fiore and Forza Nuova pledged to achieve the hegemony on no-vax and no-vax, as they are called in Italy, so the anti-vaxxers and the anti-mask movement. How? Well, the first 3 months of lockdown that in Italy lasted from March 2020 to May 2020, Forza Nuova tried across social networks, especially Facebook and then Vaccination, to organize protests in different parts in Italy, but always at the centrum in Rome, because Rome is the most important center for traditionally for neo-fascism in Italy, and where Forza Nuova has the support of football fans from the football team of Roma and Lazio. They organized a march at the end of April 2020, refusing to respect the restriction against movement and so on. But these marches were always not able to catalyze a big support. After that, Forza Nuova tried to unite with other movements, some of them really freaky one, like the so-called orange vests, modeled on the example of the French yellow vest by the former general of the Italian Carabinieri, Antonio Pappalardo, that is famous for his conspiracy theories and his very strange affirmation. Forza Nuova had an agreement with this movement, and formally Forza Nuova, that is still existing, but formally is disbanded, stating that they had a new party with Pappalardo and with other conspirative theorist figures, like the philosopher Diego Fusaro, called Italia Libera, Free Italy. At this moment, and for all fall 2020, the main idea is to protest against the restriction and trying to infiltrate, as it was in October 2020, the demonstrations made by people coming from cafe and restaurant business and tourism business for obtaining more support by the state. There is a fact that these words coming from the far-right ambience went to conditionate the rhetoric of Matteo Salvini and of the League, that started to support some ideas. The most famous it was in April 2020, when Salvini relaunched a fake news made by ambient of the Italian far-right about the invention of the COVID-19 in a Chinese laboratory. And this led to a big scandal and big problems with China. And together with this, they tried to find support in other countries. The main model for the Italian far-right is the Querdenken, the lateral thinking movement in Germany. That is too conditioned by the presence of far-rightist and neo-Nazi presence, but as in Italy, there are people coming from New Age, the ambience from far left, and so on. The attempt made in Italy, it is similar, and after 1 year of attempts, with the beginning of the vaccination campaign, it seems to have a result. The two issues are about the strategy of the far-right and the Forza Nuova in this period is an attempt to have achieving hegemony on a marginal yet noisy sector of society and trying to build an anti-systemic front. This is nothing new. This is something that was theorized by the French new far-right, the Nouvelle Droite, in the 70s about the anti-systemic front. Roberto Fiore, that led at the end of the 70s third position, the Italian terza posizione, was not new to these issues. And the other one is a common place for the agenda that is influenced more than fascism, but neo-Nazism and the influence of Julius Evola on Italian neo-fascism about anti-enlightenment, anti-scientific thought, melted with influence by Buddhism and other things. There is an issue that these arguments against vaccination and against the existence of COVID are having a growth into anti-Semitism in different European countries. I took out the case of Italy using the data provided by the Italian Observatory on Anti-Semitism. During the year 2020, the topic of the poisoner Jew was present 135 times in 300 anti-Semitic accounts on Facebook. And here are some pictures of these accounts that you can state here. The typical representation taken by the Die Stürmer about the representation of Jews that is called as bringing the virus. And of course, the link between Bill Gates, George Soros, the Rothschild, and so on. In a kind of specular, but no less anti-Semitic wave, there is the attribution of the role of the anti-vaxxers, seen as resistance, as being persecuted as they were the Jewish population during the Holocaust. And so we have accounts on Twitter like this, in which at the place of Arbeit macht frei on Auschwitz Gate, there is the word the vaccine make you free. And on this argument, there is the use of symbolistic here, for example, non-vaccinated with a chip. Of course, that I will not speak for because of absence of time, but the issue of having a microchip on vaccine is quite common, and calling the vaccination campaign as vaccine Zionism campaign. The query for Jews coronavirus during 2020 had a growth during that time. The most high is during the first lockdown, that is from March to June 2020, and giving so an association of this. Facebook is still the most used instrument for drawing out anti-Semitic propaganda, followed by Zoom. In the last year, there was this practice by anti-vaxxer and anti-Semitic activists to interrupt in some way discussions on Zoom by leftist activists, anti-fascist activists, and Jewish activists, trying to interrupt this discussion around. The vaccination was connected by the far right by one of the last topic of this time, the Great Reset, that is really common on the far right, and not only on the far right, on the national populist press and propaganda. For example, Matteo Salvini 4 years ago talked about the Great Reset made by the mass immigration to Europe. And the Great Reset here, it is coming to from the influence of QAnon movement and of this book made by this Dr. Joseph Mercola with the foreword by Robert Kennedy Jr., that is one of the main opinion leader of anti-vaxxerism in the world, and it is bringing out on all the far right and the populistic media. For example, here there is a BioBlue that is assigned.
Dr. Savina, please 1 minute.
Okay, it is one of the main media new resource of populist and anti-vaxxers, activists, and of fake news. And here, the last one, and I will stop. Then there are 2 guides organized by anti-vaxxers that reminds the guides that are made by the health institution in Italy. For example, there is 8 motives for saying no to the vaccine. In conclusion of this, there is something common, the assault to places that are considered responsible for the Great Reset. In August 28, 2020, it was the time of the Reichstag in Germany, assaulted by a crowd led by people linked to Querdenken. On January 6, there was the time of Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. for other reason. But on October 9, the demonstration of anti-vaxxers ended with an assault led by the leader of Forza Nuova, Roberto Fiore, against the largest trade union in Italy, the CGIL, that the last time that was assaulted, it was at the beginning of the fascist regime. That's all. Спасибо.
Thank you very much, Mr. Savino. И я хотел бы сейчас передать слово...
So that I would like to pass the floor to Maxim Volkov, who is Director of the Inter-Regional Public Movement for Democracy and Human Rights. You have no more than 10 minutes. My name is Maxim Volkov. Just to avoid any misinterpretation, I will try to be very brief, try to speak in bullet points. I will try to bring you from Italy and Central European nations to the post-Soviet territory. Let's speak about the growth in influence of ultra-right parties in the post-Soviet territory and in Eastern European countries. Let us focus on citizenship and language issues. All in all, as proceeds from most of presentations today, we see some rise in the ultra-right sentiments in Europe, which take place against the backdrop of the economic crisis, the financial crisis, and moreover against the backdrop of crisis of COVID-19. But still, there are still countries in the region where this growth is more pronounced. And first and foremost, these are the Baltic countries and Ukraine, where in essence we see a transition of the public policy, incumbent one, to not to control of the alt-right movements. It would be too aggressive to say. Very often my opponents at the international fora told me that they don't have any representatives of the alt-right movements either in the government or anywhere else. But we see what is taking place. There is a shift, and we see equal and similar statements which are made by ultra-right movements everywhere in the world. And at the same time, we see that the ultra-right rhetoric becomes the same as the rhetoric of the government. So how it comes about in the societies against the backdrop of the crisis, ultra-right sentiments are very widespread. What the representatives of these movements say becomes the mainstream idea in the society. Why? Because the ultra-right parties and movements give very simple answers to complex questions. These answers are certainly wrong, and we cannot agree with them, but they are very simple and very clear for unprepared people who suffered certain hardships amid that crisis. This is first. Those who aspire to be populist certainly are armed with those ideas eagerly and seeking votes and seeking influence in the society. They are using them in practice. Why actually this goes on in the post-Soviet territory? Let's look at the genesis of how it came about. Many of these countries were set up on the basis of denial of the Soviet legacy, denial of the Soviet Union. And the USSR was perceived as an enemy from which they separated and reclaimed their independence. Once you set up your state, you need certain heroes, certain role models, those who were engaged in that struggle. And for the Baltic nations and for Ukraine, these role models were the ones who fought against the USSR. And they chose the collaborationist organizations of the World War II, who continued their work in migration, and they resumed to that upon return to their home countries. Altogether, it results in the fact that the ultra-right sentiments in these countries are not something condemnable, not something which cannot be celebrated. And as a result, these ideas become a mainstream one. Secondly, these ideas are propagated. As far as the EU authorities and international organizations are not doing anything about that, we see a spreading of these ideas further to Europe. And hence we see the representatives of a neo-Nazi organization, Brigade and Azov movement, which are recognized as neo-Nazi one at the top level. It's been recognized as a neo-Nazi organization by a number of European authorities, and it is recognized as such by the US Congress. But still, the representatives of that Azov movement meet the top brass in Europe. Besides, we see that the representatives of this Azov movement meet ultra-right organizations all over Europe, setting up a kind of neo-Nazi international. At the same time, the military drills which are held in Estonia or in Lithuania, for instance, would be engaged by neo-Nazi movements from the European nations. So therefore, this is how the memory of the military criminals is being glorified. In politics, it results from the fact that the simplest decisions, when we're looking for scapegoats, are reflected in the legislation. And first of all, these have a say on the citizenship and language. In the Baltic nations, for instance, in Latvia and Estonia, ever starting from its setup, they initiated a non-citizen status, and despite lots of solutions, lots of decisions, and regulations which were passed by the international community, nothing can be done about that. Still, there is such a status of a non-citizen assigned to certain people in the Baltic nations and Ukraine. Some language laws are adopted, the laws on education, which in essence stress the mono-ethnic nature of the state and in essence would repeat the ideas which are expressed by ultra-right movements and parties in these countries. And not to abuse your attention, let me proceed with the conclusions. And conclusions are not very inspirational. So the crisis goes on. And as we see, the international organizations, the European organizations, cannot do anything about that rise of extremism and meddling of ultra-right movements in the mainstream politics. So it means that these ideas are supported in the society and the influence would rise in future. Thank you so much. Thank you. That was Maxim Vilkov. I apologize for confusing his name. Well, no problem. Well, I thought of your some Polish origin. Apologize once again. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, we have exhausted our agenda for today. We ran out of time, and I know that Valery Engel is concerned about the beginning of the next session. I'd like to thank everyone who took part in that. Thank you so much for your presentations. And thank you for the links to your reports, which you published on the chat box. Thank you so much. And I hope that I also coped with my role as a moderator. Thank you so much, Ilya, Tarasov. Those who opt for the session on Russia, please switch the streams. And here we'll speak about the South and North America, and I'm passing the floor to Barbara Molos, postdoctoral research fellow. We worked with her as she prepared a brilliant report along with her co-author on Canada. She works for the Department of Sociology, University of New Brunswick, member of Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism